It seems that we are all here. Please welcome Anna Vovchenko on stage. Big round. So I've been told that Anna had to travel a little bit to come here. Let's guess. How many hours Anna had to travel to come in? 20? More? A little bit less, 30. Between train and plane and train, Anna has to travel 30 hours to get here. Let me leave the stage to Anna, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it was quite a trip. So, hello everyone. My name is Anna. I'm a senior front-end engineer at GitLab. I'm from Ukraine, and that's why I traveled a lot to get here. We have a pretty tough situation with logistics right now. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to present as a GitLab team member. We, as a GitLab, are an open source end-to-end software development platform with a huge team of more than 1,300 people and a giant code base. So we are using Vue on the front end, and the last time I checked, we had over 3,000 Vue files in our main repo. Among our key values, we have efficiency and results. So we have to be extremely careful with our code base to make sure it's easy to maintain, it's clear and clean, and works as expected, as fast as it can. One of the instruments that help us to achieve these goals is reusable components. And this is the topic of my talk. So this is a link to my talk on JoinedIn. I'll appreciate your feedback and ratings. During the talk, we'll clarify the mystery around the reusable component. We'll take a look at what it is, why do we need it, we'll see how a reusable component works, what is its anatomy, and we'll also have a little practice learning to create a reusable component and to use it in different scenarios. I'll show some real-world examples from GitLab codebase. Let's dive into it. Starting from the beginning, what is a reusable component? So a reusable component is a special chunk of code that has its purpose. It's better to be a single purpose. Like, for example, a button component's purpose is to handle a user's action on click. And the icon's purpose is to take care of being visually consistent with other icons. Or the drop-down, the goal of which is to hide and show some content. So it should be rather simple. But we don't want it to be too simple as well. Like, we don't want to create, probably, we don't want to create a reusable component to just add a title, because we can just use an appropriate HTML tag and some CSS styling for it. A reusable component should be neutral and doesn't depend on context, so that we can use it in different scenarios. So our button shouldn't care about its context, and it can serve its purpose being a part of a form or a banner or a modal or like anywhere. It is quite rare to have a reusable component that you can reuse exactly as it is, so it should be somehow customizable. And the most important thing about the reusable component is that it should be used more than once. And we can start thinking about creating a reusable component when we code ourselves copying and pasting, like a lot. Or when we need to update something, like, for example, the designer asked us to update the color, and we are updating 3,000 files. It is not something we want to do. I think so. But we can also predefine which components should be reusable. Like, I mean, there's no way a website could have only one button. A system of reusable components can be a great tool for communicating with product designers and implementing design guidelines. At GitLab, we have our design system called the pajamas. It is called the pajamas as it's nice and comfy, and also because at GitLab, we all work from the comfort of our homes in our pajamas. Soon being an open source product, we need to help our engineers and community contributors to contribute with confidence and follow our best practices. The pajamas design system is a single source of truth for everything anyone needs to know about contributing to GitLab. Here is an example of the page my team was working on. It is related to our feature, GitLab Agent for Kubernetes. It helps our users to manage their Kubernetes clusters. It shows some information, a structured list of available agents and some info about each of them. It has some links to deeper level pages and documentation. It also contains some actions. The user can remove an agent, create a new one, or leave feedback. Can you already spot some reusable components used here? Yes, it's good. So let's see which components we used to build this view. So spoiler alert, everything. So we have in-page navigation using tabs, a button group for the generic actions not related to a specific agent at the top. The information is presented in the car. There's another card actually on this page that didn't make it to the screenshot. We have a badge, a link, and a banner with a button inside the car. The information for each specific agent is structured in the table component and contains some links, buttons, icons, and tooltips. For me, it took around 20 lines of CSS to create the whole page. And using the reusable components here helped to boost the development, testing, and the delivery speed. We are getting close to the main question. Why do we need reusable components? Using reusable components helps to save a lot of time. So firstly, for the designer to create a repetitive UI element, then for the development to implement this repetitive UI component, and then to test, document, and review it. It significantly reduces onboarding time for new engineers and helps to reduce time to market, which can greatly benefit your organization. Using reusable components results in creating less code. Less code is easier to maintain. It is also easier to fix or update in a single place. Reusable components are consistent, which increases usability, improves user experience, and accelerates user adoption. A smaller code base loads quicker. So reusable components can help to improve performance. The more code we write, the more possibilities for making mistakes we create. We still need to write a good code in order to benefit from the advances that reusable components help to gain. But we have less space for mistakes and a nice opportunity to improve our tests. The benefits of the reusable components are pretty ambitious. But how does it actually work? So we have our reusable component, which is a logical piece of code. Certain point of it should be shared. For example, some abstract logic, like the logic of toggling for the dropdown or hiding for the banner. Accessibility. Reusable components help us to maintain consistency in the accessibility terms. Thank you, Jay-Z. Like focus state, screen reader friendly attributes, or help text, or much more that we already heard in the previous talk. The tests are also shared for all instances of the reusable component. We don't have to test all individual buttons' behavior if it already tested and documented on the component's level. Together with this, some elements should be customizable in order to make it possible to reuse our component in different contexts. It is visual design. It can be different types of buttons or a customizable theme. It is the content, because other way it will decrease the possibility of reusing significantly. And sometimes we need to customize the markup of the component. This is where the scope slots can be handy. Here is an example of a simple reusable component, as simple as a single icon. We can see that it has a rather small template, basically just an SVG element with a number of attributes. It needs a link to the sprite set, It has some logic to add appropriate styles and a test ID. It also contains accessibility-related attributes and accept listeners via the listeners property that contains listeners used in the component so that we can forward it using VON directive. What is shared and what is customizable in our icon component? The fact that it's an SVG element with its CSC classes and is a shared feature, as well as the accessibility attributes. We can customize the icon size, its name and label on the other hand. The icon component is a very simple example, but it shows a healthy ratio between shared and customizable features. Let's take a look at the structure of reusable component. What instruments do we have to achieve a certain point of reusability? A reusable component has its anatomy like any other component, actually. It contains tip plates and styles that indicate the visual side of the component. It uses props to get the customizable values. It requires interactivity and events to communicate with the user and the Vue app. We are already familiar with the template of the icon component, and here is its styles. We use SAS preprocessor here to build our CSS. You can see some of its features here, like nesting, each loop, and interpolation. Looking at this example, all that it does, it lets the color to be set from outside and limits the icon to be square and to use one of the available sizes. The icon component has just a few props, as we might have already expected when we were looking to its template. It accepts a label but doesn't require it. Then it needs an icon name that should be one of the sprite icons, hence the validator. This validator checks if the given icon is one of the valid options and throws a warning in the console if not. This is useful when the component is intended to be used by others. And it also accepts a size value, which should be one of the sizing options and defaults to 16 pixels. We've already seen how this property is used in the SVG class and how these classes are defined in the CSS. The icon component doesn't have any methods, as it doesn't have much to do. But for the sake of transparency, I added an example of basic events. These events fire a corresponding method and promote it to the parent, where the actual logic usually contains. Now, I think it's a good time for us to do some practice now. Keeping in mind benefits, principles, and the structure of reusable components. The examples that I'll share are all based on GitLab design system, the pajamas. We are currently using Vue 2 in our GitLab design system, but the examples will also make sense for Vue 3. Let's create a reusable component. I think an interesting thing to work on would be the button component. And it's also the most popular thing. It is broadly used, it has different types and states, and interacts with the user. I created a skeleton for our button component. It already represents the principle of having shared versus customizable elements. As the very first step, it presents an HTML button element that expects some content in its default slot. To get the content from the parent, we can use slot outlet, which indicates where the parent provided content should be rendered. We can have as many slots as needed and provide slot names for each of them. In case of the button component, we'll only need one, so no need to name it. We could also provide a default value for the slot, but we won't need it in this example. I can already predict some other components that we will need here, as well as some props and computed properties that we'll use for our button component. As the next step, we can add a bunch of customization styles. According to our design guidelines, a button should have a category, a variant, and a size. A category brings varying action hierarchy and emphasis that guides the user when performing an action. A variant is a visual style, depending on the type of the action and its importance. And the size is pretty self-descriptive. Based on these instructions, we'll add corresponding props, all of them except strings that are not required because we have defaults. And I think it's a good idea to use defaults in this case. These visual settings can be implemented using the CSS classes. We can add a computed property named button classes to generate a list of the needed classes. It's a nice idea to use computed properties because, as opposite of methods, they are cached based on their reactive dependencies. And we are not expecting any of the previously added props to change during the button's lifecycle. We'll add a generic class GLButton that represents all of the GitLab UI buttons and combine the variant and category props to get a specific class for each visual difference, as well as a size class. As an option, we could just add these classes from where we add a button component. But our way, it is more descriptive, it's easily readable, and we can also benefit from the default values without having a need to redefine properties in CSS. Now we are ready to use our customized styles. Let's bind the button classes computed property to the HTML button class. And just like that, we created all these different button styles. We can now easily add an appropriate button to any view component in our app and be sure that they all look consistent and correspond to the design. From this point, we can also change the whole design system by updating the related CSS. All the buttons in the project will get updated at the same time with minimum effort. We can always add more options to each property and create more varieties of the buttons. In this case, we'll just need to add a proper CSS class and it will become supported immediately. So the reusable component is a scalable instrument. Usually, a button can have different states, such as focus, disabled, selected, and loading. Let's assume we already handled some of them, for example, active and focus states within the CSS. These are the states that button usually gets into within user interaction. But the other states are very possible to be added programmatically. Let's start with the selected and disabled states. We can add the corresponding props expected to receive booleans that are not required and default to false. This approach makes sense, as we will only have one of two options. The selected state would be added as a special class conditionally to our button classes, computed property. The above syntaxes means that the selected class is toggled, depending on whether selected is true. In Vue, it's possible to use object syntax inside the array syntax. Having a computant containing all of the class logic and binding it to the element class is considered a common practice. The disabled state should bind to the disabled attribute directly. It should be enough to style based on the disabled attribute. And here is the result. We have the selected button that is a secondary default button, but we can also have the same result for each of the buttons we already added. But based on our design guidelines, all the buttons, regardless of their visual styles, are the same when disabled. So it's like the only option for us. As a nice UX improvement, we might want to add a tooltip explaining why the button is disabled and what are the circumstances to make this action possible. In our application, we would probably face a situation when a user clicked a button, performed some action, but haven't yet got a result. The request is still sending to the backend, or the backend is doing its magic. From the UX standpoint, it would be a nice idea to communicate it with the user, so that the user knows that the button indeed works and the app is trying to process the request. As we want our button to support loading state, we will just add a corresponding prop, which is also a non-required boolean and defaults to false. Based on these props, we can add a new computed property, isButtonDisabled, that indicates the disabled state of a button. We don't want our user to be able to click over and over again when we are still trying to proceed with his first request. Showing a small spinning icon before the button content would be self-descriptive. In the GitLab UI library, we already have a load and button shared component. It is designed to show a little spinning icon. In our template, we'll need to update the disabled attribute to bind to the isButtonDisabled computed property and add a spinning element conditionally while the loading persists. It has its own property inline and some classes related to this specific case. The changes we just implemented result in nice loading button. It can be pretty helpful to improve the usability of the website. One last thing I'd like to add is an icon. We have a set of icons in our GitLab UI project which implements the pajamas design guidelines, and we can use some of them here. We will only need to know a name of the icon, as the other properties are predefined in the style guidelines. We need to add a prop icon, which is a string. It is not required, actually, because we don't want it to be there every time. We can use a computed property to specifically check if the icon is present, and then use the icon component, which we are already familiar with. We'll update the template to include the icon component conditionally. It has some specific to this context class and sets the name of the icon from the icon library. Here is the result in different combinations of the icon usage within our button reusable component. From here, you can see why we didn't want to add any default data to the slot element, as we wanted an option to create an icon-only button. Later, we might also add a tooltip to explain the meaning of the icon-only button, but we'll leave it as is for now. There's one small improvement I'd like to make. Currently, in case our button is an icon-only button and its state is loading, we can have two icons and no text in our button. So, the design guidelines recommend to replace the icon with a spinner in this scenario. And to achieve it, we'll need to acknowledge when the button slot is empty. We have only one slot, so checking for the slot's length is enough. We'll store it as a computed property and use it directly in the template. As you can see, we aim to show an icon only in case the icon is present and it's not a loading state while no content other than the icon was provided. The result will look like this. It's now getting more obvious that we need a way to communicate with the user on the purpose of the icon. It would be great to add a title, a label, or a tooltip for our icon-only button, but there's always room for improvements, so we'll wrap up here for now. To this extent, the button component is clean, self-explaining, and pretty flexible. As we worked according to the design guidelines, we created all the visual combinations and worked through different scenarios. We did spend some more time to create this reusable component, but once it's done, we are only saving the time. This one component created today is one less component to create tomorrow. As we feel pretty confident about the button component, let's try to use it. Let's try our primary confirm button. It is designed to provide the strongest visual emphasis to the action once per context. You can see it in the banner in the top example, in the model in the middle one, and just an individual button in the button set in the bottom one. To use this component in our Vue app, we need to import it and register it in the component list. The component is called GL-button. This example is from the page we've already seen at one of my first slides. As you can see, we specified variant and category properties to define the button type and visual appearance. We set the button text to use the value stored in the option, which is register for this case. The button has a disabled state that uses the value of the computed property. The state remains disabled until the user completes the previous selection. Finally, the button component gets the click event and sets the required action, for this case, to register an agent. This view handles the loading state separately and doesn't need a loading icon, so we don't use it here. Another example is from the other reusable component, the banner component. It requires some additional functionality that we didn't cover while we were creating our button component. At this point, the button component can handle the href element and create a link instead of the button when needed. It still has the variant category attributes, some data test ID to help us with test. It uses the click event for the button. Then it also contains a prop button link, which is not required. Depending on the props given, it would either use the href attribute or the click event handler. Finally, it sets the content of a button or a link from the prop button text. I wanted to include this example to show how the reusable component can be very flexible, even generating the proper markup based on the settings. Another interesting kind of a button that is used widely across the project is a delete button. Its main action is showing the confirmation model, which is implemented within the custom directive GL model directive. It has a disabled state dependent on the value of the delete button disabled computed property. It also has an area label property specified with the text delete agent. And the time is flying, so let's move on. The reusable components is not something that you can start using only if you plan it in advance. It's absolutely okay to refactor the existing code to use our shiny new reusable button component. As I was searching for a real example from our codebase, I was surprised in a positive way that among more than 1,500 buttons that we have in our application, only 64 are still using plain HTML button element. In case of this particular button, we can see that it's an icon-only button. But its design doesn't correspond with any of the varieties and categories combination we've already created. It might be perfectly fine to use it as is. But if one day the decision to change it according to the design system will come, we can easily refactor it to GL button. As you can see, we are leaving all the attributes and properties as is, and simplifying the markup by removing the inner GL icon component. We know that our button accepts the icon name and can handle the icon itself. We can also specify the size and some CSS classes to make it look more like it used to be, if needed. We walk a long way, not like really a right way, but a long way to familiarize ourselves with the benefit of the reusable components. We found a way to create one and saw how it can shine being used in the real code base. Let's make a small summary. While it's cool to create a reusable component, it isn't a goal. It is an instrument we can use in order to solve some particular problems, such as consistency, usability, accessibility, maintainability. It should help to speed up a lot of processes: development, review, testing, creating the design, making updates, onboarding new engineers, and as a result, the delivery process. While we do need to spend some time designing and creating a reusable component, it should pay off in the long run. It should help to maintain clean code efficiently and increase predictability of the app's usage. In fact, a good set of reusable components should make our life easier. Thank you, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you, Anna. We received some questions for you from the folks online. I read the question from Ivan. Do you think that using dynamic classes binding in template is a good way to handle classes, or handling them in computed or method is a way better approach?
I think handling it with a computed property would be the best approach. I think it has some benefits. Like, I wouldn't use method for it if it doesn't contain particularly difficult, complicated logic, and if it doesn't need to update during the life cycle of the component. That's why I would rather use the computed property, and I think it is more readable than just bind everything in the template.
Thanks. Any question from here, from the audience?
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was amazing, and it's fun. I think we're doing it wrong at doing it right in my company, so it's good. What we might be doing wrong, and I want to ask is like, we are now looking into migrating our components to Vue 3, and it's a lot of challenge regarding versioning and stuff like that. Not necessarily the technical part. So do you have any plan to do the migration?
Thank you for the question. It's a really great question. And if it's actually what we are trying to do, we are on our way. It's a long way, but I think it can be much faster because we are using these design system components, and it would be much more complicated to update without any reusable components for just our 3,000 Vue files. Yeah, we are on the way, and I wish you good luck on your way as well.
Any other questions?
Hi, thanks for the great speech. I was just wondering about, I noticed in the CSS code that you were using Sass. Were you able to inject the props into the CSS? And because I noticed that you had the size property, that's something that is interesting that I've never seen before.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we can actually inject it, but it's not according to our guidelines because it's not as readable. And also in our styles, everything contains a utility class, a single class. It's our aim. And you can also use this class outside of the component. So we don't want to tie it with the component's logic, and we just want to leave its logic for the CSS and just use a proper class in the component. Thank you.
Hi, the main question from marketing point, we have a lot of sites, a lot of subdomains, and a very big, a lot of buttons. So the main question is this reusable components effect on the search engine scoring, so the rank of the sites, etc.
Thank you for the question, and it actually does. It usually improves the performance as we are creating less code and it's quicker to load. And also we can handle some accessibility attributes here, and Google likes it. Google will rank it higher. And we can also do something that Google really likes, like to provide the exact size of the icon or the exact size of the image that we are using on the website. It is easier to do such in the component.
Any more questions? Okay. Given that we have a minute, I do have a question. I was wondering about how do you prefer to handle tests when it comes to reusable component, what kind of details you get into, what kind of things you focus on testing?
That's an excellent question, actually. So we can test all the logic that we provided in the reusable component within the unit testing of this reusable component. And I think it's a good practice. And then we don't need to worry about showing loading animation in our button on loading state. We can just check from the parent component if the button did receive this loading property. And then all the logic that button performs for us is already tested, so we don't need to repeat ourselves every time.
Thank you. Let's give a big round of applause to Anna again.